good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the open house tonight. I will share my screen here, and then we will walk through the overview of the draft long-term plan. So as Art mentioned in the outset, we're here to present a draft of the long-term transportation master plan for the City of Mission at tonight's open house. What we'll be going through with this particular presentation before we get into the questions and answers and any discussion is to give you an overview of the planning process, the study process that we've gone through to develop the plan over the past year, walk you through the key elements and features of the draft plan, talk about the financial implications and considerations of the long-term plan, and then, as I mentioned, we'll open it up for questions and answers. So the objective of this particular meeting is really to share with you the preliminary draft of the long-term master transportation plan, which we're calling Mission Mobility 2050, and share this with attendees here today, and to provide you with the opportunity to ask any questions and receive any answers from the team that's here tonight, and also provide you with next steps. So as we are sharing this draft long-term plan, as Art mentioned, this is what we're presenting to the public as a draft, and we'll be taking feedback from the public and stakeholders to help refine and finalize the plan before we take it to council for adoption. So getting into the plan purpose and process. So this is an update to the city's existing transportation master plan, which was developed in 2016. And as Art mentioned, the city generally is looking to update the transportation master plan about every 5 years to reflect changing conditions and priorities and align with other initiatives. So there's a number of reasons why a transportation master plan is important, and also why this update at this point in time is important. So firstly, it's an opportunity to align with current best practices and other city and regional plans, policies, and initiatives. And of note, the city has developed an updated official community plan, or OCP, since the previous TMP was developed. The Fraser Valley Regional District is currently developing an updated regional growth strategy, and TransLink in Metro Vancouver is also developing an updated regional transportation strategy. There's lots of initiatives that are happening around the region that kind of call for this to be an important time to develop an updated city plan to make sure it aligns with some of those initiatives. The plan also is aiming to respond to planned growth and development, recognizing the plans for growth in a number of areas in the city, the Silverdale area, Cedar Valley, and then currently a waterfront master plan that's taking place. This is an opportunity to update growth projections and make sure that we're integrating the directions from those plans into a broad citywide transportation master plan. Ultimately, this plan is looking to guide the city's investments and decision-making related to all modes of transportation over the next 30 years. And when we're talking about all modes of transportation, we're talking about vehicles and people driving, as well as transit, walking, cycling, and goods movement. And ultimately, through that, looking to create a plan for everybody and a balanced plan that meets the needs of all of those road users that I just mentioned. So the process we have been going through to develop the draft plan, it's a 5-phase process. And as Art mentioned, we've been working on this over the past year or so. We launched the project last winter, and then over the course of the winter and spring, went through our kind of initial round of background review to get an understanding of existing transportation conditions and issues and challenges in Mission, through some technical analysis and our first round of public engagement. And we use that to then move into phase 3 in the spring to start putting together possibilities about what might be possible and thinking about a vision and some goals for the transportation master plan, as well as more concrete strategies and actions. And then we've been working over the summer to refine those options, and that's what we'll be presenting here tonight. The final phase, phase 5, is called Moving Forward, and this is where we would really be developing a detailed implementation strategy. So what we're going to be presenting tonight is really looking at the long-term plan, and the final step is to then take that and identify short-term, medium-term, and long-term priorities with kind of a clear action plan to help guide the city as it moves forward. So I mentioned we had an initial round of engagement in the first phase of the study. So that took place in December of last year and January of this year. And we had an online community survey. We had 168 responses to that survey. And we were really looking to understand through that survey what people's priorities were for the transportation system and how they currently travel in Mission, and really understanding what are some of the barriers and opportunities related to each mode of transportation. We asked a number of questions about what are your preferred outcomes from the transportation master plan. And we heard that the top priority for outcomes was to have a plan that helps to reduce travel times and congestion throughout the city, but also looking at opportunities to provide more transportation choices and improving traffic safety. And we also asked which modes of transportation were the most important. And we heard that driving was the most important and top priority, followed by transit and walking. Much more detail was provided through that survey. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the things we heard through that survey. And we're now in round 2 here and conducting this virtual open house, and again, presenting key elements of the draft plan tonight. So we'll be presenting with you a vision for the plan, some goals for the plan, and what we're calling pillars and themes, as well as strategies and actions. And we're working through this process with the public, as well as doing some stakeholder engagement to get input on the draft plan. So with that, I'll introduce the actual draft plan itself and walk you through some of the key features of the plan. This slide here is really just showing the structure or outline of the draft plan. So there's 5 sections that are included in the long-term plan. There's an introduction section, which kind of highlights some of the pieces I was just mentioning there. There's a section called Drivers of Change, and this is really looking at why a transportation master plan is important. What are some of the existing conditions for transportation in Mission, and what are the key factors that influence transportation, and why this is an important plan, and looking at things like climate change and public health and road safety and housing affordability, and some broad factors that really are important to consider when we're developing a transportation master plan and thinking beyond transportation itself. The third chapter focuses on establishing a vision for the future of transportation in Mission. And we have a vision and some goals and objectives and targets, which we'll explain as we move through the presentation. The fourth chapter is what we're calling pillars for the transportation master plan. And these are some foundational elements that kind of go beyond transportation itself, but are very critical to shaping how people move through the city. A couple of examples of the pillars that we'll be talking about would be road safety, which encompasses all modes of transportation. Another pillar is looking at the need to integrate land use and transportation planning. And we'll explain those as we move through the presentation, but really some foundational pieces that we need to consider as part of the transportation master plan. Before we get into the final chapter, the integrated mobility plan, and that's where the plan will get into specific strategies and actions for each mode of transportation, with chapters on walking, cycling, transit, driving, and goods movement. So we've developed a draft vision for the transportation master plan, and you can see some key words that are bolded throughout the slide here. And some of the reasons we've bolded these are some key themes that we'll come back to in terms of the objectives for the plan. And a lot of these are kind of key themes that we try to build upon that are already identified in the city's strategic plan and the city's official community plan. And we wanted to make sure that we're really integrating the direction from some of those other city documents into the vision for transportation. So the vision, the draft vision, is that Mission will be a sustainable, safe, and thriving hillside community nestled between the Fraser Valley and the Coast Mountains. Our urban and rural communities are connected with a multimodal transportation network that supports residents and visitors of all ages, abilities, incomes, and identities to move safely and comfortable while using active transportation, transit, and driving. And the second paragraph is kind of speaking to how this aligns with some of the other aspirations that the city has. So making bold moves to make the mission we want while maintaining our small town community feel and friendly neighborhoods. We will ensure health and safety is the top priority when improving the transportation system, and we'll use progressive, forward-looking strategies to connect people and goods to one another and across the region. So it's kind of a broad statement, encompasses quite a few themes there. But getting a little bit more specific, the plan then identifies 6 goals, and each of these have a number of much more specific objectives as well. And I won't go through the objectives in this presentation, but kind of highlighting what those overall goals for transportation would be. So we've got these 6 that you can see here. The first goal is to have a safe community and really looking at improving road safety. As I mentioned, that was a really key theme that we heard from the community survey in phase 1 of the project. and really looking at how the city can reduce injuries and fatalities on the transportation system. The second goal is looking at creating a complete community, and this is looking at how we can integrate land use and transportation and focus on providing transit and active transportation in areas where there's higher density and mixed land uses, where it kind of land use and transportation can support each other. Thirdly, looking at a thriving community, and this is really looking at how we can make the city more vibrant and prosperous. So creating a city that's people-friendly and looks at the needs of pedestrians and creating great places, and also looking at economic prosperity and encouraging people to kind of shop locally and live locally, while also supporting goods movement and supporting local businesses through the transportation system, and making sure we're considering the needs of both people and goods movement. The fourth goal is looking at a sustainable community. So this is prioritizing sustainable forms of transportation, like walking, cycling, and transit, as well as zero emissions vehicles and other new technologies that can help work towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the city. Fifth is looking at creating a healthy community. So again, kind of prioritizing active forms of transportation and encouraging active and healthy living where people can walk and roll and cycle within their community. And then finally, goal number 6 is looking at an accessible and equitable community. And this is making sure that the transportation plan really includes and considers people of all ages and abilities and incomes and backgrounds, and making sure it's an inclusive transportation system and that people have the mobility choices so that they can travel conveniently by whatever mode of transportation they choose. We also have a proposed target in the Transportation Master Plan, and our target is looking at what we call mode share. So that's the percentage of trips made by different forms of transportation. And currently, when we're looking at sustainable forms of transportation, walking, cycling, and transit, those 3 modes make up about 8% of trips in Mission or made by Mission residents today. And the plan is looking at doubling that roughly to about 15% of all trips by 2050. So the next piece gets into kind of the structure of the plan. And from here on, it's really focusing on how we would propose to achieve that vision and goals and targets. So I've mentioned, if we start at the bottom of this slide, I mentioned the pillars that are included in the Transportation Master Plan. And I'll walk through each of these on the next slide, but we put these at the bottom again because these are really foundational elements that are important to consider for all modes of transportation. So we're looking at, again, safe mobility and working towards significantly reducing injuries and fatalities on the transportation system. The second pillar is land use integration, and really recognizing land use is probably the most important factor that influences how people move through the city. The third pillar is thinking about streets not as just for vehicles, but streets for people, and recognizing all road users as we plan and design our streets. The fourth pillar is looking at changing technologies. And so how can we plan for new and emerging technologies, things like electric vehicles or zero emissions vehicles, but also e-bikes and e-scooters, car share, ride sharing, and all these kind of new forms of transportation that are coming onto the landscape, and how we can proactively plan for those in this document. Fifth, looking at asset management. And so this is making sure the plan is considering not just kind of upfront capital costs, but the ongoing maintenance life cycle costs of maintaining its infrastructure. And then finally, a pillar, again, looking at equity and accessibility and making sure we're considering the needs of all Mission residents and visitors. So going kind of beyond each of those 4 pillars, the plan then would have or does have specific strategies and actions for each mode of transportation, looking at active transportation, goods movement, driving, and transit. So that's kind of the structure of the plan, and we'll now walk through a little bit more detail about what each of these entail. So we'll start with the pillars, and I mentioned, again, there's 6 proposed pillars in the plan. So the first pillar, again, is looking at strategies for safe mobility. And again, this is looking at how we can reduce serious injuries and fatalities on the city's transportation system. And there's a number of suggested kind of strategies and policies that we would be recommending. Firstly, to adopt and implement a traffic safety strategy. Developed a traffic safety strategy. And as part of the TMP, we're looking at developing a 5-year action plan to improve road safety that builds on that traffic safety strategy with specific measures that the city can take to improve traffic safety over the short term. Secondly, looking at design treatments, how we design our roadways to reduce the risk of severe injuries and fatalities. So that includes how we can design streets to be more accommodating for pedestrians and cyclists and other vulnerable users, and intersection design and things like that. Thirdly is adopting a safe system approach, and that's what the graphic on the bottom is showing. A safe system approach is kind of a global theme related to road safety that's really looking at a number of different ways in which we can improve safety, looking at the safety of road users, so prioritizing vulnerable road users, safe vehicles, safe speeds, and safe roads, as well as looking at post-crash care after collisions occur. And so it's really kind of having a broad, holistic lens to road safety, recognizing we really need to consider everything in the wheel there if we're looking to improve road safety. The next bullet is looking at developing an all ages and abilities cycling network. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but this is making sure that cycling is safe and comfortable for people of all ages and abilities. Fifthly, using collision data and police data to really understand where collisions are occurring. And we've done collision analysis as part of the TMP, and we have an understanding now of what the top collision locations are throughout the city. So now with that data and evidence in hand, that gives us a bit of a roadmap to target safety improvements and prioritize those at those high collision locations where we know there's kind of increased benefits when we can really focus on areas where there's a significant number of collisions. And then finally, looking at reviewing and updating the city's traffic calming policy and developing a prioritized list of sites and neighborhoods for traffic calming improvements to help reduce traffic volumes and speeds on residential roads. So yeah, a number of strategies there for road safety. The second pillar is looking at land use integration. So some of the highlights for the land use integration pillar are ensuring that the transportation system supports land use patterns and that it really aligns with the direction of the official community plan or the OCP. To continue to consolidate growth within Mission urban areas, to develop what we're calling mobility hubs between sustainable modes of transportation. So mobility hubs could be located in areas, commercial areas or areas of higher density that are more supportive to transit and active transportation. And in those areas, having kind of high quality transit facilities, bicycle parking and other end of trip facilities, and making sure there's good connections to travel to those mobility hubs, whether you're walking or cycling or taking transit. The next one is looking at supporting the development of affordable residential housing in close proximity to active transportation and transit and community destinations. And again, recognizing that strong connection between land use and density with transit and active transportation. And finally, leveraging development as an opportunity to enhance the transportation network. The city is rapidly growing. It will be roughly doubling in size over the next 30 or 40 years. And so a lot of the transportation infrastructure that's recommended in the plan is really there to support and enable that development and could be provided through development as that occurs. The third pillar is looking at what we're calling streets for people. And again, this is trying to move away from thinking of streets as just for vehicles, but that we're looking at the people who are using the streets regardless of how they're choosing to travel. So this is looking at ways in which the city can create safe, welcoming, and comfortable places that are attractive for pedestrians and that can make streets enjoyable places to be, as well as developing support programs and initiatives that encourage people to walk and to highlight the benefits of walking. Looking at, whoops, lost a slide there, at changing technology. So I highlighted a few of these earlier. And so considering how transportation technology is rapidly changing and will probably continue to change at a rapid pace. So a few of the things we're including in the plan are how to plan to accommodate new modes. Again, things like e-bikes and e-scooters, as well as to plan for higher numbers of zero emission vehicles, and having things like more electric vehicle plug-in stations and e-bike plug-in stations throughout the city. Kind of related to that, to facilitate the use of more sustainable modes and missions, such as zero emission vehicles, to plan for new mobility services and devices that can increase sustainable transportation and equity, and that can decrease challenges due to topography. So again, e-bikes and e-scooters can really help deal with some of those issues, and especially topography. Using what's called intelligent transportation systems, or ITS, to improve the efficiency of the transportation system. This can include things like improved signal coordination and signal timing, so that if you're traveling kind of at the speed limit or a safe speed, all the signals are kind of coordinated efficiently. And then the last one is really looking at what could autonomous vehicles mean for the city and the region, and planning for that proactively for once they become more commonplace. The fifth pillar is looking at asset management. So again, this is looking at kind of life cycle costing in the transportation plan. So making sure that the city is really planning proactively, not just for investing in building infrastructure, but looking at the long-term operations and maintenance costs, which are very important considerations as well. And then the final pillar, equity and accessibility. So this is looking at ways to design to design the city's streets to be universally accessible. So for people of all ages, all abilities, so that everybody is able to safely, comfortably use the transportation system. We're really focusing on equity as an important consideration in the transportation plan. And the map on the bottom is showing an equity analysis that was conducted for the transportation master plan. That's really looking at where are there areas of the city that have higher concentrations of kind of equity-seeking populations. So this includes some low-income groups or new immigrants, indigenous communities, and children and seniors, and making sure that we're really prioritizing those groups when we're kind of developing the long-term transportation plan. Looking at working with indigenous communities to better understand their needs and improve mobility options across communities. And then finally, having an equity-focused lens in the city's transportation decision-making. So those, again, are all the foundational elements, and we have some strategies, as I was highlighting, for each of those. And then we move into the final chapter, which is really looking at more specific strategies and actions for each mode of transportation. So this is really where the bulk of the kind of concrete actions and recommendations in the transportation plan will be highlighted. So the first theme is looking at active transportation. And so this is looking at, by active transportation, we're talking about walking, we're talking about rolling, which could include skateboarding and rollerblading, e-scooters, as well as cycling. So we're kind of looking at walking, rolling, and cycling within this umbrella of active transportation. And so a number of the strategies to enhance active transportation would be, firstly, to develop a complete, connected, and accessible pedestrian network. So this is looking at sidewalk coverage throughout the city and improved trails throughout the city. And I'll show a map of that on the next slide with a proposed sidewalk and trails network. We also have a proposed cycling network that would provide citywide cycling facilities that would be comfortable and safe for people of all ages and abilities. Thirdly, looking at enhancing trails and greenways to provide recreational opportunities. And this is an important theme, recognizing the city has an extensive, well-established trail network. And primarily, a lot of those trails are likely used for recreation, but there's, especially as we've seen during COVID, a strong relationship between recreation and transportation, and really trying to tie together the kind of parks and recreation and open space opportunities with transportation. Fourthly, looking at kind of safety at intersections and crossings. So creating and enhancing existing crossings to accommodate all ages and abilities. And then finally, looking at what are some support programs and initiatives that can encourage people to use active transportation. Things like safe routes to school and wayfinding and maps of the cycling network. So I'll show a few maps here that kind of show what we're suggesting for some of these networks. This map here is showing the proposed sidewalk network. And there's a lot of colors on the map here. And what you're seeing in blue are where there are existing sidewalks. And what we'd be recommending in the plan are either streets that would be recommended to have one additional sidewalk or sidewalks on both sides of the street. And we've looked at every street in the city to kind of identify what their needs are. And ultimately, we're looking to create a pretty comprehensive citywide sidewalk network that would ensure sidewalks are on both sides of kind of major streets. So all arterial streets and collector streets and bus routes should have sidewalks on both sides of the street. And we also looked at land use. So streets that are close to schools and parks and commercial areas should also have sidewalks on both sides of the street. And also looking at other residential areas that maybe don't have a sidewalk at all today, but making sure they have at least a sidewalk on one side of the street to make sure that all streets in the city have at least some access to sidewalks. So this kind of shows quite a lot of gaps in the city sidewalk network that would need to be filled in over the long term. And again, as part of the final phase of this process, we'll be developing a prioritized list of short, medium, and long-term sidewalks. So this would be showing the long-term sidewalk network that would really create essentially almost a complete build out of having at least one sidewalk on all city streets. The second network map is focusing on cycling. And what this is really focusing on is a term I've used a few times this evening, what we're calling all ages and abilities facilities. And that's what the image on the bottom is referencing. There's a number of different types of bicycle infrastructure that we can provide. Much of what's currently in place in Mission and many other cities in Metro Vancouver and elsewhere are what you see on the left hand here, kind of painted shoulders that can be used by cyclists, or just a painted bicycle lane. But what the research and evidence across North America has shown is those aren't very effective at getting people or kind of a broad spectrum of people to feel safe and comfortable cycling. So what many cities are focusing on instead is these all ages and abilities facilities that really address one of the main barriers to cycling, which is people who don't feel comfortable riding next to busy roadways with high traffic volumes and speeds. So there's three different options. One is looking at what are called local street bikeways. These are on kind of quiet residential streets where the traffic volumes are fairly low and traffic speeds are fairly low. So it's kind of comfortable for cyclists to share the road with vehicles. And then on busier streets, looking at what are called protected bicycle lanes. So these have a physical protection, not just a painted line, to provide physical separation between vehicles and cyclists. And the third facility type is off-street pathways. And so we've identified a network that you can see in the map here that is primarily focused on those three types of AAA facilities. And then in more of the rural and outlying areas, looking at kind of painted bike lanes and shoulders. And what this network would look to establish, without going into each individual street, but you can see it kind of sets out a regularly spaced grid of east-west and north-south bicycle routes throughout the city. And it also was aimed to connect to major destinations. So making sure that it connects to all schools and to parks and commercial areas within the city. And then the third kind of piece that we'd be looking at is trails and pathways. And we have a trails map that's identified in the Transportation Master Plan. This is just showing one example of kind of one of the pieces or one of the aspirations in the trails plan would be to develop a waterfront multi-use greenway or pathway. And that would be in line with the Experience the Fraser concept plan, if any of you have heard about that, which is really a vision to create an active transportation corridor that would span the length of the Fraser River all the way from the Salish Sea right up through to the Fraser Canyon, essentially. And that would really connect all municipalities and many Indigenous communities along the way. So this really would help support that regional vision to do that. Now, the trails and pathways, it's not exclusively focused on just this waterfront connection. That's just kind of one example of some of the opportunities for trails and pathways and integrating those recreation and transportation opportunities. The second theme that we've identified is focusing on transit and recognizing that transit service is provided by BC Transit, but the city still has a role to play, especially when it comes to infrastructure, things like bus stops. And the city works with BC Transit to help kind of coordinate transit planning and to fund transit services. So looking at some opportunities for transit, firstly is ensuring that the city works closely with BC Transit to develop an updated transit network and to improve transit service. And in terms of an updated transit network, BC Transit next year has a plan to develop kind of a detailed local area transit plan for the city that would go into more detail than what's included in a more strategic level document like the TMP. But I'll show on the next slide kind of a framework that could help set the stage in identifying what are some major desire lines and key connections for transit, and really working towards a transit system that is simple and direct and easy to use, and that has frequent transit service on major corridors throughout the city. Second is looking at ways to improve the transit user experience. And so this is looking at things like ensuring bus stops have benches and shelters and lighting and amenities like garbage cans, timetables and route information and things like that, so that it's kind of comfortable and customers have the information they need when they're waiting for the bus. And thirdly, to look at the feasibility of enhancing West Coast Express service and potentially adding a new station in the Silverdale area over the long term in conjunction with the Silverdale area plan. So this map here is showing a conceptual transit network. Again, because BC Transit will be undertaking a detailed local area transit plan next year, that process will identify very specific routing. This is more identifying what are some key desire lines and making sure it's kind of setting up streets that are anticipated to kind of need frequent transit service in the future. Many of the routes within the city are kind of one-way loops, and they don't necessarily follow corridors or streets directly. So looking at BC Transit to kind of improve that and provide more frequent and direct service where possible. So some of the colors that you see on this map here, in purple is the West Coast Express alignment. So looking at enhanced West Coast Express service and working with TransLink and partners to improve that. And green is looking at enhancements to regional and interregional service. So transit over the bridge south to Abbotsford, but also east and west travel leaving the city of Mission. And then in red is that's most of what you see on the map here are kind of improved transit desire lines with increased transit frequency kind of within the core area of the city. And then in blue are some enhanced local connections, areas that don't necessarily have transit service today, but are kind of gaps in the transit system. Examples to some of the industrial areas and out to Hatsick to recommend providing transit service in the future. And then the plan also identifies some transit facilities, so some kind of major transit facilities, primarily the Downtown Transit Exchange, but also having some minor transit facilities, so some other transit hubs throughout the city. An example being a transit hub with a park and ride in Cedar Valley and in the waterfront area and potentially in Silverdale as well. And finally, this graphic here is looking at kind of a strategy that we'd be recommending to the city and BC Transit called transit optimization. So this is looking at, in addition to kind of transit service and bus stop improvements, how the transit system can be made to be more efficient. And there's a number of things the city and BC Transit can look at. Improved traffic signals and having, as an example, traffic signals where buses get priority to go through in advance of vehicles. You can look at infrastructure improvements that can help to make transit more comfortable and to prioritize that, or even looking at potentially dedicated transit lanes on high transit priority corridors and having dedicated bus lanes, or even just bus lanes in certain locations to get through intersections to help make transit more reliable, especially in areas of congestion. And then I mentioned as well the potential for a second West Coast Express station. This would likely be over the long term as growth and development occurs in the Silverdale area, and having a West Coast Express station in the vicinity of kind of Donatelli Avenue and Lougheed Highway. Again, over the long term to kind of provide high quality transit options for commuting as that area of the city builds out. The third theme is looking at goods movement and recognizing, again, this plan is looking at not just people, but the needs of commerce and ensuring kind of a thriving, vibrant city. So looking at updating the designated goods movement network, which includes truck routes and railways, continuing to work with the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure and the BC Trucking Association to explore the potential for a downtown truck bypass, and then looking at alternatives to the road network. So other ways in which goods can be transported beyond the road network, things like rail, and looking at marine networks as well, and kind of leveraging the position of the city on the Fraser River. So the key kind of network map here for the truck network, this is showing the proposed truck network, which is similar to the existing truck network, and really is focusing on designated truck routes primarily along the highways, Highway 7 and Highway 11, and the bridge to Abbotsford, as well as Cedar Valley and Stave Lake to provide north-south connections, and Dewdney Trunk Road and a few others. And that kind of helps to provide access to some of the rural areas of the city. One of the notable changes to the goods movement network is that previously 7th Avenue and then Wren Street were identified as part of the designated truck network. And we're suggesting removing that for a couple of reasons. 7th Avenue is identified as a greenway, and the city is currently moving forward with the planning and design of a greenway or an active transportation facility on 7th Avenue. It's envisioned to be a kind of busier transit route in the future. And there aren't a lot of commercial or industrial destinations on 7th Avenue that kind of require it to be a truck route. And when we looked at truck volumes, they're actually very low. It's less than 1% of all vehicles are trucks on 7th Avenue. Recognizing, of course, trucks are still able to use non-truck routes to access their destination. So even if it isn't identified as a truck route, if trucks need to access those destinations, they can still use those streets to get to their final destination. And then the final theme of the plan is looking at driving and looking at kind of vehicle movement throughout the city. So a number of strategies for driving. Firstly is looking at updating the city's street network classification and looking at ensuring the street network classification is not just kind of based on vehicle needs, but also considers kind of requirements for pedestrian and cycling facilities, and thinking about street design from a what we call complete streets lens, which again is focusing on all road users. Secondly, to develop complete streets improvement strategies for major streets. So these are looking at new roadways throughout the city and improved or widened roads throughout the city to accommodate travel demands. Thirdly, looking at safety and operational improvements. A lot of these are kind of intersection improvements where we know from our collision analysis that maybe these are high collision locations, or these are areas that have kind of been identified as having congestion issues today. So looking at those intersection improvements to improve safety and to improve traffic operations. Fourthly, to work with the ministry and coordinate improvements along the highways that run through the city. They're not within the city's jurisdiction, but the city can identify those opportunities and encourage the ministry to move forward with those improvements. Fifthly, again, the asset management perspective here, maintaining roadways in a good state of repair and thinking about operations and maintenance. And then finally, making sure we're really considering the needs of rural areas throughout the city. And obviously that's a huge part of the city's land area, and making sure the plan isn't just focused on the kind of urban core, but we're considering safety of those rural roadways as well. So looking at a few examples of some of the strategies and actions here, this map here is showing some of the kind of major projects that are identified in the transportation master plan. You can see a few colors on the map here. So in red are road upgrades. So many of these are kind of upgrading roads that are not built to a full urban standard today and maybe don't have sidewalks or curb and gutter. So improving those to a full urban standard with curb and gutter and sidewalks and lighting. Some of these would be widening to 4 lanes as well, and that would be specifically for Stave Lake and for Cedar Street, and over the long term, kind of moving from a 2 or 3 lane roadway to 4 lanes to accommodate those travel demands. There's some new roadways that are identified as well, particularly up in the Cedar Valley area, some roads that were identified in the Cedar Valley area plan, as well as a new connection that would be proposed over the long term to Silverdale as part of the neighborhood planning process for Silverdale. And then a couple of minor bridge upgrades as well are identified. Those are the lines on the map. And then the dots on the map are some of those safety and operational improvements I mentioned. So in green, those are identifying the top 15 collision locations throughout the city. Blue are areas where we know there's kind of issues related to traffic congestion today. And in, I guess that's purple, would be locations that have both safety and operational improvements. So kind of identifying what are those things the city could do at each of those kind of high collision or high congestion areas of the city to improve safety and operations. Looking at potential strategies for interim treatments as well. So, what can the city do to improve safety along some streets in the near term, even if we're working towards kind of a long-term cross-section and widening some roadways to 4 lanes, but looking at how we could do maybe interim treatments with different cross-sections, essentially to improve safety for vulnerable road users, like you see on the left here. This would be an example of an arterial road, looking at a 3-lane cross-section with protected bicycle lanes until a full 4-lane cross-section is required. We also looked at kind of pavement quality throughout the city. Again, this ties back to asset management and looking at the condition of infrastructure. And based on kind of areas that have need for pavement rehabilitation, we've identified a 10-year plan to kind of improve the quality of pavement throughout the city. And those are some of the major features in the road network plan. So, I've been talking for quite a while here. There's lots of key features that are identified in the transportation master plan and a lot of projects involved in the master plan. And so the kind of final consideration, and this is something we'll be putting together as the final piece of the plan, is what does this look like in terms of the financial implications, both over the long term, but then coming up with short, medium, and long-term priorities that work within kind of the city's budgeting and capital planning process to ensure it's an affordable plan as well. And when we look at each of the key features of the plan, I won't go through each of these in detail, but some preliminary cost estimate ranges that we've put together would be in the order of about $220 to about $320 million to build out the entire long-term transportation master plan. Recognizing, again, a lot of this would be development driven and would be provided through development as that growth and development occurs. Those cost estimates, they're still preliminary at this point, really to kind of gauge what's that order of magnitude financial implication of what's in the plan. As I mentioned, the majority of those costs are growth related and would be provided through development and through what are called development cost charges, or DCCs. And so the city can build in those costs into its DCC bylaw so that, again, they're kind of provided through the development process and not through kind of taxation or general revenues as much as possible. And then another opportunity, given the financial cost there, is looking at partnerships, things like working together with BC Transit and with the Ministry of Transportation and with developers, and also looking at grant opportunities. And there's quite a lot of opportunities out there right now, both provincially and federally. And those are great opportunities to help kind of minimize the share of the city's cost and really kind of leverage some of those other opportunities to help fund the transportation system. So that was a lot of information there. Hopefully that gives a bit of an overview of some of those key ingredients. And even the plan itself has much more detail than what we got into today. But yeah, hopefully that gives a good sense of what's in the draft plan.